Have you ever been underestimated so badly that it changed your life? This is the story of Edward James, brilliant computer science student whose talents were dismissed because he didn't fit the mold of what a real programmer should look like. In the cutthroat world of tech, Edward was relegated to fetching coffee and doing busy work while his ideas were ignored and his potential overlooked. But sometimes, the most powerful motivation comes from those who doubt you the most. When arrogant senior developer Dominic Wells mockingly challenged Edward to fix a critical bug that had stumped the entire team for weeks, a bug threatening a multi-million-dollar contract he never expected the young intern to accept. "Fix the bug, coffee boy," he'd sneered, not realizing he was setting in motion a chain of events that would expose far more than just software errors. What Edward discovered while working late nights wasn't just a technical glitch, it was something far more sinister that threatened the entire company. Something deliberately hidden. Something that would turn the tables on those who had dismissed him. They never thought the quiet intern in the corner was paying attention. They never imagined he had the skills to uncover what they'd done. They never expected him to fight back. This is a story about prejudice in the tech world. About the dangerous assumption that brilliance looks a certain way. About how sometimes the person you ridicule today might be the only one who can save you tomorrow. And it all began with a paper coffee cup sailing through the air toward an underestimated young man who was about to prove everyone wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Edward James adjusted his tie for the third time. 22 years old and already wearing a tie, not because Nexus Innovations required it, but because his grandmother had insisted. "They'll take you more seriously," she'd said, pressing the silk fabric into his hands the night before his first day. 6 weeks into his internship, and he was starting to think no tie in the world could make them take him seriously. Edward glanced at his reflection in his darkened monitor. The University of Michigan computer science program hadn't prepared him for this. The subtle looks, the conversations that stopped when he entered the break room, the way his suggestions in meetings were acknowledged with nods but never recorded in the minutes. "Hey, new guy. Coffee run." Edward turned to see a paper cup sailing through the air toward him. He caught it reflexively, years of basketball instincts kicking in. Dominic Wells, 36, senior developer and self-appointed king of the coding floor, leaned back in his ergonomic chair, a smirk playing across his face. His desk was a shrine to his achievements, framed certificates, tech conference badges, and a trophy from some hackathon that he mentioned at least once a day. "Black 2 sugars," Dominic called out, not bothering to look up from his 3-monitor setup. "And make it quick. Some of us are doing actual work around here." Edward felt heat rise to his face but kept his expression neutral. 6 weeks of this, and he'd learned that reactions only made it worse. He collected orders from 2 other developers who suddenly realized they needed caffeine too. Convenient timing as always. As he waited for the elevator, Edward pulled out his phone and opened the internship countdown app he created. 6 weeks down, 6 to go. Just enough time to get a recommendation letter that might land him a real job somewhere else, somewhere that might actually let him code. "They send you on another coffee, Ron." The voice came from behind him, warm and tinged with disapproval. Edward turned to see Zoe Alvarez, one of the few mid-level engineers who actually treated him like a human being. "It's fine," Edward said, shrugging. "I don't mind." "You should," Zoe replied, stepping into the elevator alongside him. At 29, she was younger than most of the senior team, but had earned respect through sheer force of will and undeniable talent. "You're not here to be their barista. You're supposed to be learning." Edward stared at the elevator buttons. "Not much chance of that when they won't let me touch anything important." "What did they have you doing yesterday?" "Reorganizing the documentation library." "Worse," Edward said with a wry smile. "Dominic had me debug his personal website. It was just a missing semicolon in his CSS. The elevator doors opened to the lobby, and Zoe stepped out with him. "You know, I saw your application portfolio. The machine learning algorithm you designed for traffic pattern recognition was impressive. We could use that kind of thinking on the Nexus Core project." Edward felt a spark of hope. The Nexus Core was the company's flagship product, an AI-driven data analysis system used by Fortune 500 companies worldwide. Working on it would mean actual coding, actual experience, an actual future. "I'd love that," he said, trying not to sound too eager. "I'll talk to Trevor," Zoe promised, referring to Trevor Hamilton, the company's CEO. "He's been stressed about the bugs in the latest build, but he's always looking for fresh perspectives." As Edward pushed through the revolving doors toward the coffee shop across the street, that spark of hope grew into something warm in his chest. Maybe things were about to change. The hope lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, until the afternoon stand-up meeting. "We've got a critical situation with the Nexus core," Trevor Hamilton announced, his 45-year-old face lined with stress. Once a coding prodigy himself, Trevor had founded Nexus Innovations 15 years ago. Success had turned his dark hair silver at the temples and added a permanent furrow between his brows. "The Morrison account is threatening to pull out if we don't fix the data processing lag." The team of senior developers shifted uncomfortably. The Morrison account represented nearly 30% of their annual revenue. "We've isolated the issue to the parallel processing module," Dominic said, stepping forward confidently. "My team has been working on it for 3 weeks." Edward, standing at the back of the room with the other interns, noticed how Dominic emphasized "my team," despite the fact that at least 4 other developers had been pulling all-nighters on the problem. "3 weeks is too long," Trevor said, running a hand through his hair. "Morrison needs this fixed by the end of the month, or they're walking." "We need more resources," another developer suggested. "We need more time," said another. Edward studied the diagram on the whiteboard, a flowchart of the Nexus core architecture. Something about the parallel processing module didn't look right to him. The way the data streams were being prioritized seemed inefficient based on what he'd learned in his advanced algorithms course. "Sir," Edward found himself saying before he could stop himself, "do you consider that the issue might be in the queuing algorithm rather than the processing module itself?" The room fell silent. All heads turned toward him. Edward felt his mouth go dry. "And you are?" Trevor asked, squinting at him. "Edward James, sir. I'm interning with the development team." Dominic let out a sharp laugh. "He's the coffee guy, Trevor. Don't mind him." Several developers chuckled. Edward felt his face grow hot. "No, go on," Trevor said, waving a hand. "What about the queuing algorithm?" Edward swallowed hard. "Well, from what I can see on the diagram, you're using a standard FIFO queue for all data streams. But with the volume of information coming through, you might benefit from a priority-based system That's not the issue." Dominic cut in, his voice sharp. "The problem is in the processing module's memory allocation. We've tracked it for weeks. But if the data isn't being prioritized correctly before it even reaches the processing module, then—" "Look, kid," Dominic said, turning to face Edward fully now, his expression a mixture of amusement and annoyance. "Why don't you stick to fetching coffee and leave the real coding to the professionals? You've been here, what, a month?" 6 weeks, Edward corrected quietly. 6 weeks, Dominic repeated with a smirk. "And you think you've spotted something that my team of senior developers missed after 3 weeks of intensive debugging?" The room felt too warm. Edward could feel everyone staring at him. "I'm just suggesting an alternative approach." "Tell you what," Dominic said, his voice taking on a mocking tone as he glanced around the room, ensuring he had an audience. "Why don't you fix the bug?" More chuckles rippled through the group. "Dominic," Zoe warned from across the room. But Dominic was on a roll now. "No, really. If the intern thinks he's got it all figured out, let's see what he can do. Fix the bug, coffee boy. Show us all how it's done." Edward stood frozen, humiliation washing over him. Trevor checked his watch. "All right, that's enough. Dominic, I want your team working around the clock on this. We need a solution, and we need it yesterday." As the meeting broke up, Edward turned to leave, eager to escape to the relative anonymity of his tiny desk in the intern corner. "Edward, wait." It was Zoe, her face a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked like respect. "Don't let Dominic get to you," she said quietly. "He feels threatened." "By me?" Edward couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "I'm just an intern who spotted a potential issue that his team missed," Zoe pointed out. "And for what it's worth, I think your theory about the queuing algorithm has merit." Edward shook his head. "It doesn't matter. No one's going to let me near the code anyway." Zoe looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe not officially," she said, lowering her voice. "But every developer has after-hours access to the repository, including interns." "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Zoe said, small smile playing at her lips. "I'm just stating a fact. The building's keycard system logs everyone in and out, but no one checks who's working late. Especially not on the weekends." She walked away, leaving Edward standing there, his mind racing with possibilities. Back at his desk, Edward found a new task in his inbox, reorganizing the company's digital asset library. Another meaningless job to keep the intern busy. But as he mechanically sorted through files, his thoughts kept returning to the whiteboard diagram and Dominic's challenge. Fix the bug. 3 simple words, meant as a joke, meant to put him in his place. But what if he could actually do it? What if he could solve the problem that had the entire development team stumped? It was a crazy idea. Reckless, even. If he messed with the code without authorization, he could kiss his internship goodbye, along with any hopes of a recommendation or a future in tech. But as Edward glanced across the office and saw Dominic holding court at his desk, laughing with his team, the decision crystallized in his mind. Sometimes you had to risk everything to prove your worth. That night, long after everyone else had gone home, Edward swiped his keycard and returned to the empty office. The security guard, an older man named Raymond Jefferson, gave him a curious look but waved him through. "Working late, young blood?" Raymond asked. "Got a bug to fix," Edward replied, surprised by the determination in his own voice. As the elevator doors closed, Edward took a deep breath. He was about to cross a line. But sometimes lines needed to be crossed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Edward sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. The office was silent except for the gentle whirring of the air conditioning. He pulled up the repository and began to dig into the code that powered the Nexus core. Challenge accepted, Dominic, he thought as his fingers flew across the keyboard. Let's see what this coffee boy can do. The office took on a different character at night. Without the constant buzz of conversation and keyboard clicks, Edward could hear the building settling around him. The soft glow of his monitor illuminated his face as he navigated through the labyrinthine codebase of the Nexus core. 3 hours in, and Edward's initial confidence was waning. The system was more complex than he had anticipated, layers upon layers of code built over years, some of it elegant, much of it patched together under deadline pressure. But he pressed on, mapping the architecture in his mind, following the flow of data through the system. Still at it, huh? Edward nearly jumped out of his skin. He spun around to find Raymond Jefferson, the night security guard, standing behind him with a steaming cup of coffee in each hand. "Figured you could use this," Raymond said, setting one cup down beside Edward's keyboard. "Been watching you on the security cameras. You haven't moved in 2 hours." "Thanks," Edward said, taking a grateful sip. The coffee was strong and sweet, exactly what he needed. "I didn't realize I was being monitored." Raymond, 58 with salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp, chuckled. "Part of the job, young blood. Gotta keep an eye on all you night owls." He gestured to the chair beside Edward's desk. "Mind if I sit for a minute? Legs aren't what they used to be." Edward nodded, surprised but not displeased by the company. Raymond eased himself into the chair with a soft grunt. "So, what's got you burning the midnight oil? Must be important." Edward hesitated, then decided there was no harm in telling Raymond the truth. "There's a bug in the system. A big one. And I'm trying to prove something by fixing it." "Prove something to who?" "To the senior developers. To myself." Edward rubbed his tired eyes. "To everyone who thinks I'm just the coffee guy." Raymond nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I know something about that. Been working security here for 12 years. Before that, I was a sergeant in the Army. Got a degree in criminal justice that nobody seems to care about because I wear a uniform and a badge that says security instead of police." He took a sip of his coffee. "People look at you differently when they've already decided who you are and what you're capable of." "Exactly," Edward said, feeling a surprising kinship with the older man. "It's like I'm invisible until someone needs coffee. So you're gonna fix their bug and make yourself visible." "That's the plan. If I can figure it out." Edward gestured to his screen. "It's more complicated than I thought." Raymond leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite the late hour. "Mind if I ask what kind of bug we're talking about?" Edward explained the issue with a data processing lag, walking Raymond through the basics of how the Nexus core worked. To his surprise, Raymond followed along, asking insightful questions that helped Edward clarify his own thinking. "So it's a traffic problem," Raymond said when Edward finished. "Too many cars trying to use the same lane at once." Edward blinked. "That's actually a perfect analogy. Seen it happen on the I-94 every day for 20 years, Raymond said with a shrug. "When I was in the Army, we had a similar issue with supply convoys. Priority vehicles needed to get through faster, but if you just let them cut the line without a system, you end up with chaos. Edward sat up straighter, something clicking in his mind. That's it. The system is treating all data requests with equal priority when they should be weighted. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up a new section of code. Raymond watched in silence, sipping his coffee, as Edward began to work with renewed energy. The next time Edward checked the clock, it was past 3 a.m. Raymond had long since returned to his rounds, leaving Edward alone with the code and his thoughts. He was deep in the repository now, examining the parallel processing module that Dominic's team had been focused on. The code was functional but inelegant, with multiple patches layered on top of each other. But something didn't add up. As Edward traced the execution path, he noticed odd patterns, inefficiencies that seemed almost deliberate. That can't be right, he muttered to himself, opening another file. The more he looked, the more irregularities he found. Small changes that made the code slightly worse instead of better. Optimizations that had been reverted to slower implementations. Comments removed that would have helped explain the system's logic. Edward pulled up the commit history, checking who had made these changes. A pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. Dominic Wells. Nearly all the problematic code changes had been committed by Dominic over the past 6 months. It could be a coincidence, Edward told himself, not wanting to believe what the evidence was suggesting. He dug deeper, pulling up older versions of the code from the repository. The picture became clearer with each commit he examined. The Nexus core had been running smoothly until Dominic began making these subtle changes that wouldn't cause immediate failure, but would gradually degrade performance over time. Edward sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Why would a senior developer deliberately sabotage his own company's flagship product? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a notification popped up on his screen. A new email had arrived in the company system. Normally, Edward wouldn't have access to other employees' emails, but in his exploration of the system, he'd accidentally logged into a development environment with administrative privileges. The email was addressed to Dominic Wells from an external address, revalticrecruiter@gmail.com. Dominic, the offer still stands. VP of Engineering, double your current salary, full benefits. All we need is for Nexus to lose the Morrison account first. Our investors are convinced it will tank their valuation enough for our acquisition offer to look attractive to their board. Keep up the good work. Edward felt sick. Dominic wasn't just making coding mistakes, he was deliberately sabotaging Nexus to help a rival company acquire it at a bargain price, with a cushy job waiting for him afterward. His mind raced through the implications. If he reported this now, would anyone believe him? And in turn accusing a senior developer of corporate sabotage? Without concrete proof beyond an email that he had accessed without authorization? Dawn was breaking outside the windows when Edward made his decision. He wouldn't just fix the bug, he would fix it in a way that would expose Dominic's sabotage and prevent similar attacks in the future. For the next week, Edward lived a double life. During the day, he was still the quiet intern who fetched coffee and organized digital files. At night, he became something else entirely, a detective unraveling a web of deliberate sabotage and an architect building something new from the compromised foundation of the Nexus core. Raymond became his confidant and unexpected mentor, bringing him coffee during his late-night coding sessions and offering perspective when Edward became too deep in the technical details. You need to think about the human element, Raymond advised on the third night. This Dominic fella, he's going to fight back when he realizes what you're doing. No, Edward said, rubbing his tired eyes. That's why I'm building in safeguards. I'm creating an audit system that will track and flag suspicious code changes, especially ones that degrade performance. Smart, Raymond nodded. In the Army, we call that creating accountability. Nobody can mess up if everyone can see what they're doing. By Friday night, Edward had not only identified and fixed the original bug by implementing a priority-based queuing system, but he had also meticulously documented every instance of Dominic's sabotage. He had built a new security layer into the system that would monitor for similar patterns of degradation, automatically flagging them for review. But his most elegant creation was what he called the transparency module, a system that would generate visual representations of code changes and their impact on performance, making it impossible for someone like Dominic to hide the effects of their sabotage behind technical jargon. As he put the finishing touches on his work, Raymond appeared with the now customary cups of coffee. Big day tomorrow, huh? The security guard asked, settling into what had become his usual chair. How did you know? Edward asked, surprised. Raymond smiled. You've got that look. The same look my unit had before a mission. Determined. Ready. Edward nodded, saving his work and committing it to a private branch of the repository. I'm going to push these changes right before the Morrison presentation on Monday. If I'm right, the system will run better than it ever has. And if anyone tries to check what changed, they'll see exactly what your friend Dominic has been up to, Raymond finished, raising his coffee cup in a toast. To justice, Edward clinked his cup against Raymond's. To making myself visible. As he left the building that night, Edward felt a strange mix of emotions, fear about what might happen if his plan failed, determination to see it through, and underneath it all, a quiet pride in what he had built. Whatever happened on Monday, he had proven something to himself. He wasn't just the coffee guy. He was a developer, a problem solver, a creator. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Edward reviewed his code over and over, testing edge cases, checking for vulnerabilities. By Sunday night, he was confident in his solution but terrified of the confrontation to come. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Remember what I told you about standing your ground, young blood. You earned this. Edward smiled, wondering how Raymond had gotten his number before realizing the security guard probably had access to employee records. He texted back a simple thank you and tried to get some sleep before the most important day of his career. Monday morning arrived with a sense of inevitability. Edward dressed carefully in his best shirt and the tie his grandmother had given him. As he rode the elevator up to the office, he mentally rehearsed what he would say and do when the moment came. The office was buzzing with tension. The Morrison presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m., and everyone knew how much was riding on it. Edward spotted Dominic huddled with his team, looking uncharacteristically nervous as they made last-minute preparations. Zoe caught his eye across the room and gave him a curious look, perhaps noticing something different in his demeanor. Edward just nodded to her and headed to his desk. At 9:45, with 15 minutes to go before the Morrison executives arrived, Edward made his move. He pulled up the repository and prepared to push his changes to the production environment. Just as his finger hovered over the Enter key, he felt a presence behind him. What do you think you're doing? Dominic's voice was low and dangerous. Edward turned to find the senior developer standing over him, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Fixing a bug, Edward replied, his voice steadier than he expected it to be. Step away from the computer, coffee boy, Dominic hissed. Whatever you're doing, it stops now. Edward held his gaze. I know what you've been doing, Dominic. I've seen the code changes. I've seen the emails. Dominic's face paled slightly before his expression hardened. No one will believe you. You're nothing here. We'll see about that, Edward said and pressed enter. His changes began uploading to the system. Dominic lunged for the keyboard, but Edward was faster, locking his computer with a keystroke. Too late, Edward said quietly. It's done. Dominic's face contorted with rage. You have no idea what you've just done, he spat, before storming off toward the server room. Edward took a deep breath and stood up. Phase 1 complete. Now came the hard part. Trevor Hamilton was standing at the front of the office, welcoming the Morrison executives as they arrived. Everyone was moving toward the main conference room for the presentation. Edward followed, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. The truth was about to come to light, one way or another. As he took a seat at the back of the conference room, Edward caught Raymond's eye through the glass door. The security guard was making his rounds, but paused long enough to give Edward a subtle nod of encouragement. Edward nodded back, drawing strength from the gesture. He was ready for whatever came next. The lights dimmed as Trevor prepared to begin the presentation that would determine the fate of Nexus Innovations. Trevor Hamilton stood confidently at the front of the conference room, his presentation queued up behind him. The Morrison executives, three serious-looking people in expensive suits, sat in the front row, expressions neutral but expectations clearly high. Thank you for coming today, Trevor began. We understand your concerns about the performance issues in the latest build, and I'm pleased to tell you that my team has been working tirelessly on a solution. He nodded to Dominic, who moved to the laptop connected to the projector. Edward watched, heart racing, as Dominic prepared to launch the demonstration. As you'll see, Trevor continued, we not only addressed the lag issues but have made significant improvements to the overall system architecture. Dominic clicked the button to launch the Nexus core. The loading screen appeared on the projector, and then nothing. The screen froze, then went black. Error messages began flooding the terminal window that had popped up. The room fell silent. Trevor's smile became fixed, a mask hiding rising panic. "Just a moment," Dominic said, voice tight as he frantically typed commands. Minor technical issue. But the errors continued to pile up. Edward recognized what was happening immediately. Dominic had tried to implement an emergency sabotage, a kill switch designed to make the system crash catastrophically. Except it wasn't working as Dominic expected. Instead of simply crashing, the system was running Edward's new diagnostic tools, capturing and logging Dominic's attempted sabotage in real time. "Perhaps we should take a short break," Trevor suggested to the increasingly uncomfortable Morrison executives. "That won't be necessary," Dominic said, his voice suddenly cold. He straightened up and pointed directly at Edward in the back of the room. "We appear to have been sabotaged." By him. All heads turned toward Edward. The room felt suddenly airless. "This intern has been accessing the system without authorization," Dominic continued. "He must have introduced these errors. Probably couldn't resist trying to play with the big boy's code." Trevor's face darkened with anger. "Is this true?" he demanded. Edward stood slowly, aware that his entire future hung on the next few moments. "I did access the system," he admitted. "But not to sabotage it. To fix it." He walked to the front of the room, feeling everyone's eyes on him, and to expose who was really causing the problems. "This is ridiculous," Dominic scoffed. "You're going to believe an intern over me?" "I don't need anyone to believe me," Edward said calmly. "The evidence speaks for itself." He reached for the laptop. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Trevor nodded. Edward typed a few commands, and the main screen came to life again. But instead of the Nexus Core interface, it displayed his transparency module, a visual representation of code changes over time, color-coded by their impact on system performance. "This shows every change made to the Nexus Core over the past 6 months," Edward explained. "Green indicates performance improvements. Red indicates degradation." The visualization was stark, clusters of green from various developers, and a clear pattern of red changes all from one source, Dominic Wells. "This is a mistake," Dominic protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No mistake," Edward said, typing another command. The screen switched to show the email Edward had discovered. This was sent to Mr. Wells last month from a competitor. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as people read the damning message. Dominic lunged for the laptop, but Raymond Jefferson, who had quietly entered the room, caught his arm. "Easy now," the security guard said firmly. Trevor read the email, face growing redder by the second. "Dominic, is this true? You've been deliberately sabotaging us." "It's not what it looks like," Dominic stammered. Edward typed another command, and the system came fully online, faster and more responsive than anyone had seen it before. "I fixed the actual bug," Edward explained, "by implementing a priority-based queuing algorithm and reversing the deliberate inefficiencies that were introduced. I also added a security layer that monitors for suspicious changes and an audit system that makes all code contributions transparent." He turned to the Morrison executives. "Your data will now process 40% faster than before, with complete transparency into any future changes." The lead executive, impressed, leaned forward. "You did all this yourself?" "As an intern." "Yes," Edward said simply. "Young man," the executive said, "I think Morrison Industries might have some projects that could use your talent directly." "Hold on," Trevor interjected, finally recovering from his shock. "Edward is a Nexus employee." He turned to Dominic, voice hardening. "Or he will be, once we have an opening for a new senior developer position." Security escorted a protesting Dominic from the room as Trevor seamlessly took over the presentation, showcasing the improved performance Edward had delivered. 3 months later, Edward sat at his new office, no longer a tiny desk in the intern corner, but proper space with a nameplate, Edward James, head of security architecture. A knock came at his open door. It was Zoe, now his colleague rather than his distant supporter. "The new interns are starting today," she said with a smile. "Trevor thought you might want to give them the welcome talk." Edward nodded, remembering his own first day and the long journey since then. "Definitely. No coffee runs for this batch." As he walked toward the conference room where the new interns waited, Edward passed Raymond in the hallway. The security guard gave him a proud nod. Standing tall now, young blood, Raymond said with a smile. All because someone believed I could, Edward replied. He entered the conference room to find 5 nervous-looking interns, diverse in background but united in their uncertainty, just as he had been not so long ago. Welcome to Nexus, Edward began. My name is Edward James. 6 months ago, I was sitting exactly where you are now. He smiled, thinking of how far he'd come from being the coffee boy. And let me tell you a story about why you should never underestimate what you're capable of.